A haunting tale of paradise lost, set against the backdrop of clashing empires. This is a story of betrayal and redemption, of two families and the land that claims them both. There are secrets buried deep beneath the red Nova Scotia earth, secrets from a turbulent past. For 25 years, one man has searched for his ancestors' settlement.
No one else had ever found that village, and I wondered why, but I was intent on finding it.
A determined young woman was curious about her own family story.
I knew my family had been here for a long time, but I didn't really understand the context of what that meant.
When you stand there on that land and you let your imagination play out, it's almost as though there's something in your genes that comes back to you, and you can, oh, I'm feeling this. It's kind of a spiritual thing.
These two people's stories are entangled in a devastating chapter in our history, the destruction of Canada's first European settlement. The Mi'kmaq called it Acadie, a land of abundance. The Europeans called it Acadia, after the Garden of the Gods in Greek mythology. But it was the same place, a paradise that was built by men and women who harnessed the sea. The Acadians diked the lowlands along the bays and tidal rivers, rather than clear the uplands like other settlers did. It was an ancient technology, but the Acadians made it work here, where the tides are some of the highest in the world. The land they reclaimed became the most fertile and productive in North America. And for this, it was prized by their neighbors. The land would be their salvation, but it would also be their downfall. This was home to the Acadians, present-day Nova Scotia and southern New Brunswick, a bit of northeastern Maine and southeastern Quebec. Though the original Acadian settlers had come from France, and most were Catholic, they no longer see themselves as French. But they have never become British. In 3 generations, Acadian settlers see themselves only as Acadians.
In fact, one of their governors said that they were little republicans. They were used to governing themselves. They had learned about the institution of village councils. They were interested in independence, autonomy, practicing this newfound way of life.
After 100 years of settlement, the Acadians are thriving.
The trees that they had planted were now starting to grow. The gardens that they had planted were blooming every summer. They had really settled here, and it was a permanent settlement.
The Acadians, unlike almost everybody else in the world at the time, lived in a place where they could feed themselves, they could clothe themselves, where the fertility rate was extraordinary. It was even higher than Quebec's, where they had no major outbreaks of epidemics, where they had no major famine. They had not heaven on earth but they had a human communities which were not disrupted by the four horsemen of the apocalypse.
But the Acadians exist on a continental fault line. They are trapped between two aggressive imperial powers, England and France, that fight for supremacy in the colonies. By the mid-18th century, the Acadian lands have been handed back and forth between England and France 6 times. But most Acadians aren't aligned with either empire. Their closest allies are the Mi'kmaq, who show them how to survive in the New World, how to catch fish and build canoes. Some Acadians are even married according to Mi'kmaq rite.
It kind of built this kind of solidarity between the two. And there was a kind of a bonne entente between the two cultures.
The relationship with the Mi'kmaq certainly had moments of uproar and certainly had occasional raids, but on the whole, there was nothing compared to what went on in New France or in New England, nothing at all. The men did not have to plough with a gun in their hand. And the Acadians believed that, like the Mi'kmaq and the birds, Acadia was theirs. If you can't see that they got that conviction, you won't see what the community is trying to do. They believed they had a right to live there. And by the middle of the 18th century, they were convinced of it. It was our land.
Not everyone thinks it ought to be. 400 miles away, down the Baie Française, is brash New England, with 30 times the population of Acadia. The city of Boston is big and getting bigger, and filled with people who are beginning to see themselves as Yankees and not only British subjects. The Acadians trade their cattle, fish, and produce for manufactured goods from Boston. But theirs is a difficult relationship. The Acadians call the Yankees our friends, the enemies.
When Acadians saw a ship on the horizon, they, on the one hand, were thrilled with the prospect that it might be a Yankee trader with new goods to trade. On the other hand, scared to death that it might be a Yankee raider come to burn their communities.
They have to deal with them both, friend and foe.
So the Acadians, I think, yes, were playing a sort of Russian roulette, if you want to, but I think that they didn't have much choice.
Over the years, the Acadians swear oaths to both French and British thrones, but they have cleverly developed the position that they will not bear arms for either side.
The Acadians, after all, had had English, French, English, French, English, French, English. And who was to tell them in 1730 that the English were going to last forever?
They insist on being neutral, and for over a century, the Acadians play by their own rules. But in 1730, an anxious George II is sitting on the throne of England. He wants an unconditional oath from all his subjects. Nova Scotia Governor Richard Phillips knows the Acadians won't give the king what he wants.
Let's get some sort of oath out of them. We're not going to enroll them in the army. They're Catholic. Can't trust Catholics. Never know what they're going to do. They're farmers. When we really get serious about this place, we're bringing our own. In the meantime, we'll take an oath, no matter quite what it is.
Je promets et jure sincèrement en foi de chrétien.
I promise and sincerely swear as a Christian that I will be entirely faithful and will truly obey King George II, whom I acknowledge as Sovereign Lord of Acadia or Nova Scotia. So help me God.
They sign the oath, but they add a condition in the margins of the document. They refuse to take up arms against the French or the Mi'kmaq. Governor Phillips accepts their terms, but he only tells London what London wants to hear.
I have managed to acquire the complete submission of a people who have been obstinate for so long.
And I think that the British officials in charge of this oath-taking business lied like flatfish. I think they wrote back to London, and in fact it's quite clear that they wrote back to London and said the Acadians have taken the oath. And they didn't expand on this at all.
By signing this oath, the Acadians believe it will ensure their survival, their religion, their homes, and for 25 years, they live in peace. But in 1748, the battle that will shake the entire continent is brewing, and the Acadians' conditional oath is not good enough. In North America, France builds up an imposing fortress at the mouth of the St. Lawrence to guard the continent, Louisbourg. Across the bay in Nova Scotia, the English are building up their city, Halifax. For the two empires, there is no room for neutrality. There are only allies and enemies. And a new Nova Scotia governor is convinced the Acadians are on the wrong side.
Charles Lawrence, bad-tempered by nature, convinced that you show people a firm hand, and convinced you're never going to make this a British colony unless you get rid of the Acadians. You just don't. I mean, it can go wash.
He writes to his superiors in London.
The French inhabitants must be driven totally away by fire and sword.
Lawrence's counterpart, Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, is of the same mind. He becomes the driving force behind the campaign.
If I had an army, I would march to Minas and burn Grand Pre. I would destroy their dikes. I would devastate the countryside.
Shirley, an extremely successful British colonial politician, and enough of a military person to want to get rid of any threat, however small, to Massachusetts' dominance.
Shirley was really was instrumental. He was really the, in French we say maître d'œuvre. You know, Lawrence, yes, played a major role, but Shirley was really the man that was behind all of this.
And I need not repeat how ready I am to contribute everything in my power towards hastening this happy event.
His timing is perfect. Massachusetts is experiencing a terrible depression in the 1750s.
It was a large-scale unemployment, a lot of misery, a lot of unhappiness, and Puritan ministers in Massachusetts interpreted this as a sign of what they called the final days.
French Catholics are the open enemies of God's church, members of the kingdom of Antichrist. Let there not be an unwilling mind or a faint heart in any son of New England.
Editorials appear in the newspapers, exhorting them to stem the spread of papist evil.
We are now upon a great and noble scheme of sending the neutral French out of this province. If we effect their expulsion, it will be one of the greatest things that ever the English did in America.
Shirley issues his call to arms.
Enlist none but able-bodied men of perfect limbs, no Roman Catholic, nor any under 5 feet 2 inches high without their shoes.
It takes only 6 weeks for 2,000 volunteers to answer that call in Boston. They are farmers, barbers, carpenters, and shoemakers.
Typical for any campaign, the recruitment of the militia force was sweetened with a bounty. It was a small bounty, but in these days of depression, every little bit helped.
The fleet that takes them to Nova Scotia is largely composed of private ships, 31 schooners, sloops, and brigantines from the biggest mercantile companies in Boston. 3 troop ships ensure their protection. There was money to be made. The colony is looking out for its commercial interests, and Governor Shirley is looking out for his.
His position as governor was that war was good for Massachusetts, and it was good for William Shirley.
In May of 1755, an expeditionary force sets out from Boston to capture all the French forts in the area.
They wanted that isthmus cleared. And Massachusetts was going to provide 2,000 troops. There were 200 British troops. They're going on a nice, happy spring campaign. And they set out. And that spring campaign was enormously successful.
Within 2 weeks, the French fort Beauséjour is captured. The troops then make their way to the Acadian settlements. Lieutenant Colonel John Winslow is a 54-year-old Yankee farmer. He is appointed by Shirley to lead the deportation forces in Grand Pré in strict secrecy.
Winslow is the example of a local big man who's organizing all the local boys into an operation against the Catholics.
He orders the inhabitants to relinquish their arms and votes. Then he calls for an assembly.
I order all inhabitants, both old men and young men, as well as all the lads over 10 years of age, to attend the church at Grand Pré on Friday the 5th at 3 in the afternoon.
But he assures the Acadians there is nothing to worry about. More ships begin to arrive. They are filled with supplies, Winslow says, to provision the British troops.
The Acadians looked at the ships. They realized they were floating high in the water. They had no supplies in the hold. What could this mean?
On September 5th, 1755, the Acadians find out.
Your lands and tenements, cattle of all kinds, and livestock of all sorts are forfeited to the Crown with all your other effects, saving your money and household goods. And you yourselves are to be removed from this province.
The Acadians are stunned. They have been occupying the land for over 100 years. They have no military plan, no response.
And who had a plan if you were Jewish in 1939? Who had a plan if you were Polish in 1939? Who had a plan for Hitler's expansionist policies? You knew that there was a danger, but you didn't know how grave it was.
Families are brutally rounded up and thrown out of their homes.
And as they were rounded up and brought to the landing place, the villages were torched. And by all accounts, it was a horrific landscape of fire and ashes and runaway livestock, refugees.
The inhabitants went very unwillingly. The women carrying their children in their arms and all their goods, moving in great confusion. It appeared a scene of great woe and distress.
Let's remember, these are, for the most part, young men, mostly single, out on a tear, armed against totally vulnerable, defenseless people. The worst possible situation.
Winslow records what his regiment has burned in the districts of Minas that fall.
255 houses, 276 farms, 1 church.
In Chinguetou, in Chipodi, in Pisiguid, in Port-Royal, ragged processions are marched to the shores.
They must not put on board quantities of useless rubbish to encumber the vessels.
Anyone that was associated with the Acadians was deported. Even those that collaborated with the British.
Many families are separated. Parents from children, children from parents.
Thousands will never see each other nor their land again.
I would argue that the Acadian removal is the first episode of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing in North American history.
The deportations go on for 8 long years. Settlements are emptied out by the hundreds. Yet there are people who manage to escape.
Almost no one from the Cobequid district was deported. They all fled before, the soldiers arrived in the fall of 1755. They had all fled.
Fleeing to the woods with thousands of other Acadians, they are helped by the Mi'kmaq, who are also being driven away. They make their way to the forests of Cape Breton, of New France and New Brunswick.
They had left everything behind. They were living in shelters. They couldn't cultivate their land. They didn't have any cattle. So they were really, refugees.
They suffered terrible hardships. I mean, winters were very hard. They were promised provisions by the French Canadians. Those were very difficult to deliver.
Many die in the woods. But there is a growing resistance, led by a man they called Beausoleil Broussard.
Broussard was a militant from the word go. They, with the help of the Mi'kmaq and with the help of the French forces from Fort Louisbourg and also from Quebec, were able to mount this resistance movement for about a 5-year period.
New Brunswick becomes the scene of bloody guerrilla warfare.
There were terrible deeds committed on both sides. The British sent forces out to plunder and burn the refugee camps. In return, guerrillas raided the British encampments. They attacked British patrols. They left the bodies mutilated and scalped as a form of terror.
The years of resistance take their toll on the Acadians and the Mi'kmaq. Hundreds are captured and imprisoned, but those who are left continue to fight. The vessels that come to take the Acadians are named for Yankee girls: Hannah, Mary, Sally, and Molly. The Acadians think the worst that can happen is that they will be deported to New France or to Louisbourg, perhaps to France.
But it turned out that this was not going to be the case. But this was kept secret until they left.
Instead, they are shipped to the English colonies.
The whole plan was to disperse the Acadians in groups that were small enough that they could not reproduce their culture. It was an attempt to stamp out a culture.
Try to imagine, you know, these people going on board these ships. So you have the women with these large families, especially children, and these were the first victims, if you want to. The children were the first victims of seasickness. They would dehydrate, and you know, most of them didn't make it to their destination.
Richard Thibodeau's ancestors are loaded onto a ship called the Three Friends, bound for Philadelphia.
There were 500 on board this ship. It was not big by today's terms. They were not allowed to disembark from this ship until spring, sometime during the month of March. They had to live on this ship all winter long without provisions. They were missing socks and shirts, warm clothing, sanitary conditions. You can imagine 500 people, sickness, cramped. It is said they couldn't even lie down all at one time. They had to take turns lying down.
The exiled Acadians are scattered along the coast. The governors from Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island aren't told the Acadians are coming, and they are far from welcoming. In Virginia, they're not even allowed to disembark. The governor sends them away to England. In Portsmouth and Falmouth, the Acadians are housed in barns. In Bristol, they're bunked in warehouses where smallpox breaks out.
Acadians had had a life where endemic diseases were rare, and they went straight into being hit with yellow fever and smallpox and typhus, which they had not really experienced or built up any community immunity to, and they died.
They die in such numbers that some of the ships reach the shore half empty. No one really knows what to do with the survivors. The Acadians want to be treated as prisoners of war.
They didn't have the capacity to handle them as prisoners of war. So for the most part, they were treated under the colonial poor laws. They were bound out to labor. Children were separated from their parents and sent off as servants in rural households.
The Acadians live in refugee camps, work as hired hands in Maryland, New York, and Boston.
In Georgia, they took one look at them and said, I don't think we want you here. Why don't you take these ships and go away?
Storms and heavy seas batter the old transport vessels. 700 Acadians die when 2 ships sink. In the case of the Udi family, 100 people perish, and with them, the entire family line vanishes. In Acadia, Beausoleil-Broussard and his group are some of the last holdouts. They cling to the possibility that the French will win back Canada. They pin their hopes on Montcalm's forces at the Plains of Abraham. The battle for Canada is lost on September 13th, 1759.
But obviously when Quebec fell, they saw the handwriting on the wall, and then they decided, how will we be able to continue the culture, the identity of what we've developed? How are we going to prevent assimilation in the British culture?
Beausoleil-Broussard and his group charter a ship and leave l'Acadie for good. They eventually land in Louisiana, which is a Spanish colony.
And these Spaniards had heard about Beausoleil's group and knew they were coming and welcomed them in open arms because they needed warm bodies and settlers and people with expertise in farming, because New Orleans had a severe shortage of meat.
The Acadians are given land, seeds, and supplies to start a new life in south-central Louisiana. In exchange, they raise cattle for New Orleans and sign what is called the Dautrive Compact.
And that began the cattle industry. The first cowboys in the United States were not in Texas. Texas was part of Mexico. They were the Acadians bringing cattle in fulfillment of their obligations under the Dautrive Compact. And within 2 generations, they were on their feet financially and thriving in the Attakapaw territory. I am a descendant of Beausoleil, and I married Mary Broussard, who's a descendant of Beausoleil also. So my children have a lot of Broussard blood in them.
The Louisiana Acadians, or Cajuns as they come to be known, soon built dikes along the Mississippi River and along Bayou Teche as they had done in Acadia.
They inherently knew there was a new beginning in a new place, and their culture would continue to develop.
Most of the exiles from Maryland and Philadelphia come to join them in this strange and exotic land. The governor of Louisiana watches the colony grow.
We do not speak of them in hundreds anymore, but in thousands. At the rate they are arriving, these immigrants will soon make Louisiana a Nouvelle Acadie.
But not everyone chooses Louisiana. Some return to their homeland, but it would be their paradise no longer.
There are many stories of when the planters arrived on the shores where the Acadians had been deported from, seeing items strewn all over the ground.
The Acadian lands remain fallow for 5 years after the deportation. Then the choice lands are offered as prizes to the men who had planned and executed the expulsion.
Winslow, in fact, as part of his operation, moved around the countryside taking a look at it because he was anticipating that he would essentially act as a kind of real estate broker, handing out lands to his troops.
Whatever is left is offered to new colonists from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Nova Scotia Governor Charles Lawrence even places newspaper ads enticing the Protestants to come and settle.
Lands vacated by the French, which produce wheat, rye, barley, oats, hemp, and flax, which never need manuring, as no part has failed of crops these 100 years.
And these were not small pieces of land. They were given hundreds of acres to each family. They were given free food for a year. They would be taken care of.
When the settlers arrived in the Windsor area, Nova Scotia, there is a portion of Acadian houses and barn. There was still 35 houses there and 38 barns and a sawmill. You just moved in, light up the fireplace.
When the planters arrived, they basically stepped into paradise.
But it wasn't quite perfect. In 1759, high tides reached the dikes and flood the farmland with salt water. None of the planters know how to repair the dikes.
So in order to put the system back into shape, they brought Acadians back. They brought them back as hired workers to operate the dikes, to teach the planters how to farm the land.
It was cheaper to rent an Acadian to come work on our field, which was their own field 10 years before, They would use them as slave labor on their farm.
Many of these hired hands are still behind bars for resisting the deportation. Some of them are even hired by the planters as entertainment.
They would go to the jail to borrow an Acadian fiddler to come to the party to fiddle so they could dance, and at the end of the night they would drive him back to prison. It seemed to be a strange world.
In 1763, the Treaty of Paris allows the exiled Acadians to return. But the best land, their land, has been given away. The Nova Scotia government lets them settle, but there are conditions.
They had identified 14 settlements or places where the Acadians could settle, and they could settle no more than 10 families. And that's why, you know, today the Acadian communities of Nova Scotia especially are so dispersed.
1,000 Acadians decide to return.
That's where you were, you had been born, that's where your roots were. That's where the ocean was there, the trees were there, the soil was there. That's where our grandfather are buried, our mother. So they had to come back.
But most are dispossessed, wiped from the public record.
All the archives were destroyed to make sure that there were no traces left behind. These were all burnt in order that, you know, no one could come afterwards and say, well, this is my land, this was the land of my father and forefathers, and I have a deed here that proves that I'm the rightful owner. I think there are some similarities with actions that were taken, let's say, by the Serbs in Kosovo, where all the archives or legal documents were destroyed. The same thing happened here.
The undeniable evidence that they once lived here lies beneath the ground. A few months ago, Sara Beanlands organized an archaeological dig on her family's farm near Windsor, Nova Scotia.
We had no idea what we would find. We really didn't. But as soon as we turned the topsoil over, we realized, boom, we had an Acadian settlement here.
They found objects from the pre-1755 era from an Acadian home. Nails, clay pipes, bits of pottery, and a sewing needle.
It really moved me when I saw this needle, because it's a very simple object, but it was a very personal object, I think.
This is where Richard Thibodeau's ancestors settled, on this very piece of land.
And he lived there, and his family grew there, were born there. His father died there. From the period of about 1690 to 1755. My ancestor chose not to go back to Nova Scotia where he had left. I don't think he felt that there was anything left there for him to go back to.
And so my family arrived in 1760 in the Pisiquid area, and in fact, they made their home on what had once been Thibodeau village. It was not hard at all for me to find information about my own family. But when I went to research the Thibodeau family and their circumstances, there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing recorded to tell us that there had even been Acadian settlements in this area. Basically, it had been forgotten.
Richard had been looking into his family's story for years. Sara had been studying the history of her family's land. Together, they arrived at the same place.
So this is a story about one piece of land, two families, and a connection that spans over 300 years of history.
Only the two families have ever been on that land. That's pretty special. When I first set foot on what had been, in my mind, the actual Thibodeau village, I said, what a beautiful area. What an absolutely beautiful area. The rolling hills, the waterways, the trees. I mean, everything was just gorgeous. And my thoughts were, of course, you know, what they must have thought of this land. They were ripped from it.
In many ways, I don't think I can imagine it. I don't think I would know what that felt like, but I know how much I love this land, and it would...
Sara's family, the Shaws, invited the Thibodeaus here this summer for a gathering at their home, and the Thibodeaus came from all over.
This really feels like that this is really a reconciliation between our two families. And you're home, aren't you?
Yes, yes. It's hard to fully comprehend it, but there is a certain element of home. Yeah, it's great. It's great.
No Acadian family was left untouched by what is called le grand dérangement, the great upheaval. Every family tree has been marked by that jarring break.
I remember talking to a woman who was spinning in Cheticamp, and I said to her, what do you think of the deportation? And she said, il faut bien les pardonner. We should forgive, you know. And I said to her, yeah, now come on, what do you think of the deportation? And she said, those who did it aren't those with whom we live today. But we must make sure that it does not happen again.
Over 14,000 Acadians were deported, but many thousands escaped, resisted, and remained in Canada. Their descendants are not in the place their ancestors settled, but their culture is carried within them. And wherever they are, the Acadian identity, their poetry, their music, and their children survive.